Hey there, you probably haven't noticed, but over the past month, the war in Syria may have ended. This, of course, leaves us with the question, what now? That's what we'll be discussing in today's video. Now, as with almost everything about the war in Syria, despite what the US media tells you, it's actually the US government that largely gets to decide what happens next. First off, let's cover the extraordinary events of the past couple months. When I started this series in the summer of 2016, Bashar Assad's regime controlled none of Syria's borders. He survived because he had an outlet to Russian aid from the sea and spotty but strong connections to Iran through Hezbollah and Lebanon. But even the Lebanese border had numerous rebel pockets to contend with. His borders with Iraq, Jordan, Turkey, and Israel were all controlled by differing mixes of ISIS and other foreign-supported jihadists. Over the 2 years since, he slowly scrapped his way back to control over much of the border with Iraq and completely cleared out the pockets of resistance on the Lebanese border and in the suburbs of Syria's major population centers. Viewers of this series will be very familiar with the situation on the northern border. We've talked about Aleppo, the al-Qaeda haven of Idlib, the U.S. protectorate of Kurdish-led northeastern Syria, and the Turkish conquests in Afrin in some detail. Turkey's border with Syria will likely continue to be a fiasco for years, if not decades, to come. What has changed, and changed dramatically over the past 2 months, is the situation in the south of Syria. For 7 years, the slightly more moderate jihadists of the south have been heavily funded and heavily armed by countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and the United States. I, along with most commentators, expected this situation to last just as long as the predicament up north, if not longer. I thought about it as sort of a new Golan Heights. That territory has been occupied by the Israelis since the 1960s. I assumed that the better marketed, moderate jihadists of the Southern Free Syrian Army would be able to hold out indefinitely. The better marketing meant that they were better armed than the rebels up north, and I assumed that they would have had the complete support of the Israeli Air Force. In recent years, the Israelis have been not at all shy about bombing any Syrian or Iranian efforts to retake territory in the south. Because of that support, I just assumed that the southern rebels were here to stay, and I never really covered that aspect of the conflict much. Well, it turns out I was completely wrong about that, and I have missed my opportunity to cover the southern rebels in any detail. Over the past month or so, southern resistance has almost completely evaporated. There is still a small rebel buffer up against Israel-occupied territory. This poses an interesting propaganda problem, though, as much of it is controlled by one of Syria's last ISIS pockets, which is hard for Israel to support openly. But that's a different video. This change of power in the south is an extraordinary development, and it happened very quickly. I'm honestly a little surprised that we haven't seen another one of those chemical attacks that the U.S. government rushes to attribute to the Syrian government. I guess the southern rebels just might not have had the necessary chemicals. To the extent that this development has been covered in the United States, it's always been in the context of Russia is beating the U.S. in Syria articles. I don't think people are taking this as seriously as they should. I think this could be the end of the war in Syria. Assad will probably push into Idlib a bit, but he's constrained by actual U.S. and Turkish troops on the ground across this northern region. Unless Trump goes and starts a war with Iran or something, the issue of the north could very well be settled politically. Over the past week, we've seen some promising developments in that direction. Even if nothing changes up in northern Syria, though, Assad has most of his borders back. The region's communication and trade links, destroyed by the U.S.-created war on Syria back in 2011, have finally been put back together. Incidentally, this is great for Jordan, which has been suffering mightily from the loss of trade with Syria throughout the war. Business can start again. What we should be talking about now is Reconstruction. The $250 billion US that this is expected to take will require participation from the United States and from U.S.-supported institutions like the United Nations if it's going to be at all successful. Unfortunately, the U.S. government doesn't want to talk about this. They still want to talk about Assad. How can we deal with this monster? Are we supposed to reward Assad for brutalizing his own people? It should go without saying that I find the hypocrisy of this approach nauseating. The U.S. destroyed Syria. The least we can do at this point is help to rebuild it. As is customary with discussions of Syria, the actual interests of the Syrian people have been completely left out of the discussion. More than half of Syria's population has been displaced, both internally and beyond the borders of the country. The U.S. government's supposedly principled but actually quite childish refusal to deal with Assad risks setting up a decades-long problem, not just for Syria, but for the multiple countries around them that have taken in millions of Syrian refugees that they desperately want to get rid of. Many of these Syrian refugees would like to go home themselves. None of this is possible without U.S. support for Syria's reconstruction. The evaporation of the southern rebels has created yet another humanitarian crisis. It has also highlighted some legitimate evil that Assad is doing. In April of this year, the Assad regime's Law Number 10 came into effect. It holds that any refugee's property can be seized if they don't return within a year. Many Sunni refugees who have attempted to return to protect their property have been detained in camps, and some of them have simply been disappeared. It has been reported, and I have very little trouble believing, that Assad is trying to set up a new Syria. In Assad's new Syria, the religious minorities, like Assad's own group of Alawites and the Christians, would be more firmly in charge. This is a serious problem for a country that was 70% Sunni back in 2011. If Assad is allowed to realize his vision, it will be a disaster. A vast dispossessed Sunni minority inhabiting every serious country in the region, as well as many European countries, would be an endless source of radicalism and insecurity. As The Economist pointed out recently, we had a similar situation with Palestinian refugees after the founding of Israel 70 years ago. I don't need to tell you that the consequences of that have been dire. And the Sunni Syrian refugee population is as much as 10 times larger than the Palestinian population that was displaced in 1948. There is a blindingly obvious solution here. The U.S. government should generously fund Syrian reconstruction. But there should be strings attached. All money provided should be contingent on the peaceful welcome of returned refugees. No return? No money. Obviously, the U.S. and European NGOs that have been enthusiastically partnering with the rebels for the past 6 years probably wouldn't be eligible to carry out this oversight. Perhaps we should bring in the Chinese. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and if you'd like to help me keep making videos like this, you can make a direct donation through PayPal at the link in the description below, or you can click on the Patreon link here to find out more about my ongoing crowdfunding thing. Thanks.